Welcome in everyone to a super exciting and special episode of American Joyride. I'm joined by Brandon Blackburn. He is a former undercover CIA targeting officer. He's also the very first CIA guest the show has ever had. Brandon, we could not be more excited to have you here.
Hey, David, thank you for having me. Hopefully I do justice to my CIA brothers and sisters listening in as the first to represent that esteemed organization. Thanks for having me.
Well, I have absolutely no doubt you will. As most people watching this know, a lot of the guys who come on this show are former operators. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to go to the intel side of the world, not the military side of the world. And I always like to ask the military guys, how'd you find yourself in the military? But now I'm going to ask you, how did you find yourself in the CIA?
Yeah, man, it was a crazy path for me. And, depending on the age of somebody listening, it might be hard to relate, but I was in college during 9/11, and that day really hit me hard as someone who loves our country very much. So I was actually going to college to do similar to what you're doing, which is broadcasting. I thought, I wasn't quite good enough to play pro sports, so maybe I'll get a broadcasting degree and call play-by-play for a ball club. 9/11 really shifted my thoughts on what I wanted to do with my life, at least at that stage in my life. So as I got through college, I found myself kind of at a crossroads and looking at the marketplace professionally based on my degree. I found myself entering grad school, but I was still kind of thinking, how can I get involved in the fight? Because at the time, we're talking the early aughts of the 2000s, the war on terror after, 9/11 that ensued was everyone's priority and focus. And so I'm sitting there in grad school one day, I'm thinking about, am I going to join the military? What am I going to do after I get out of grad school? And lo and behold, one of my professors, in his bio announced that he was a former CIA case officer during the Cold War. So that got us to talking and really got me interested in the organization and, gave me an understanding of their mission, although it was shifting pretty drastically at the time because the attacks that took place on 9/11 really marked a paradigm shift for the intelligence community in particular, which I'm sure we'll get to throughout the course of our talk today. Back then you go on the CIA.gov website, they have some very nebulous job descriptions and you basically express an interest, and that's how far you get on the website at the time. And, 4 or 5 months had gone by. I kind of put it out of the back of my mind, I had heard from them, thought, what are the odds that I'm going to get in a place like the CIA with all of the mystique surrounding it and so forth. And back then we had this thing called AOL Instant Messenger on college campuses, which is probably a relic in this day and age. But I'll never forget, I was in class and I had this little beeping alert on my computer screen. And it was the woman at the front office of the graduate program. She very plainly asked, did you apply for a government position in the last 6 months? And I said, yes. And she said, well, we were just informed 2 individuals from that organization, they would like to meet with you on this day in this room. And that's all of the information I had. So the day and time come, I walked down, in my Men's Warehouse suit, feeling like just a nerve, a bag of anxiety. And I walk in and these 2, right out of central casting from a movie, they were in dark suits and very professional and stern. We're in this windowless room and spent about an hour talking through a few things, who I was, why I wanted to serve. And that started the process. It took about a year from that day until I was actually walking into the halls of Langley.
And that's what I want to get into right away. That pipeline to become the undercover targeting officer, you see in like movies, there's like The Farm, they through all this ninja shit. You're doing trade crap. Is that what you were actually doing?
Well, I'll tell you, I was initially brought in. So I was getting my MBA after getting my journalism degree, and they actually liked. I later found out they liked my journalism degree because pretty much regardless of your role within the agency, whether you're an analyst, which I actually started for a brief time in the director of intelligence. If I can explain real quick, there are 4 directorates in the CIA. So if you think of them as 4 business verticals, essentially, to anybody in the private sector. You have your directorate of intelligence. They're the analysts that they take that raw information from the field, which is generated by the operations side, also known as the DO. Now it's known as the NCS, the National Clandestine Service. And all of this is open source, so I'm not violating any trade secrets here. but you have the analysts who are, typically out of our embassies or back home at Langley, and they're trying to make sense of all this raw data and intelligence, and they're writing the finished intelligence, as we call it, fin intel, and the polished reports that are sent to the policymakers. So you may have heard in news coverage about the president's daily briefing, for instance. There are other internal documents and publications, they call it, that are provided to the likes of Congress and the military. So the analysts are charged with that. And then you have your operations side. From there, you have your science and technology. And they're the, if you watch James Bond, they're the Qs of the world. They're the engineers, the nerds. They have their little workshops that nobody is, you don't disrupt the S&T guys because they're making all the cool gadgets and so forth. And then you have your support team, your HR, your communications team, and so forth. So I was initially brought in as an analyst because they saw, presumably I had a baseline knowledge of how to write or form sentences because of my journalism degree. And then the MBA offering, they really liked because of your ability to strategize and manage. Ideally, you're taught that in an MBA course. So I was initially brought in as an analyst, which I really enjoyed, had some opportunities pretty quickly to get in front of the White House. And, you really become a subject matter expert because you're living and breathing a particular account area of responsibility.
And at this point, when you're an analyst, the war in Afghanistan is well underway.
It's underway, man. Yeah, there are things coming in constantly. And I'm an analyst under the Counterterrorism Center, which is where I stayed for the nearly 10 years I was with the agency. But you are, you're getting this deluge of information, and it's also a time when the agency is still finding its footing at how to apply its resources to this new war on terror. Because you have to remember, and anybody who's a history buff understands, up until that point, we were conducting, and I say we meaning the CIA, more traditional intelligence gathering based on the Cold War model, essentially, which the Cold War model of espionage, it could take years for you to conduct the intelligence cycle, or as we call it, CIA. So it could take a year or two at least for you to recruit an asset, because you have to, essentially befriend somebody and you have to build their trust. It could take another year or two for that person to get you the information you need. You don't have that luxury of time when you're involved in something like the war on terror, because you're trying to get intelligence to prevent the next attack, which could be happening tomorrow anywhere around the world. So there was a massive paradigm shift. I mean, I was working alongside analysts at the time that had spent years becoming fluent in Russian, and fluent in languages out of the Balkans, because that's what the CIA, the intelligence community, was still conditioned to do. And everybody got flexed to support the war on terror. And as a result, you're trying to make sense of how to vet assets. One thing about working in espionage and intelligence, your work involves three pillars: the dull, the dirty, and the dangerous. And all of that comes to a head when you're, you're fighting something like terrorism and you're trying to conduct intelligence. And a lot of times your sources are really bad actors, because they have to be able to be in the room with the likes of Osama bin Laden, right? You're not going to find really good dudes who haven't, who have clean hands, that are going to be able to get an audience with somebody like that. So at the time, as this war on terror is relatively new, we're a few years in when I joined, 2007, but they're still trying to kind of make sense of how to apply traditional intelligence gathering to this war on terror and to counter terrorism.
That's all absolutely fascinating. When you finally were able to pull the curtain back, what was different from your expectation of what you were going to be seeing, analyzing with the war on terror, compared to what reality was once the door came open and now you're in the arena, it's on?
Well, my first question during my first training class after seeing, a bunch of spy movies was, when do we get trained how to run on top of a speeding locomotive? And, that day never came, unfortunately, because I thought that looked really, Tom Cruise and Matt Damon made that stuff look really cool. As I just mentioned, we do the dull, the dirty, and the dangerous. And when you watch TV in the movies, I just saw the newest Mission Impossible the other night as example. it biases pretty heavily toward the dangerous and the really, the adrenaline fueled type of stuff. But, a lot of days can be more mundane in terms of it's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of reading and review. And especially when you're doing counterterrorism, especially when you're deploying to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, the dangerous element spikes at times, that's for sure. But, there's a sense of professionalism. And I think too, the movies, I wish things came to fruition as quickly in real life on the job as they did in the movies, whether that's, the realization we have as intelligence officers, or, there are some representations of technology that are very true in the movies, but I never got a result on some of it, in a split second like Tom Cruise or Matt Damon does. So, there was a realization, of course, up front that the mystique is once you get in, it's a lot of, professional, hardworking people. They're husbands and wives, their moms and dads. They have lives outside of the job. They just many of us felt a calling, for periods of our lives to commit to this line of work and vocation.
When you become a targeting officer, I have admittedly not a clue what that means. I'm sure most of the people watching this don't have a clue what that means. Are you the guy who, or is your team that you're working with, are you determining who they're going to go get, who they're going to drop a bomb on, where they are? Like when you hear targeting officer, that's kind of what you think.
Yeah, so you're in the right realm there in terms of that situation. So yeah, and I just real quick as an analyst, I found myself on my first overseas tour, a very senior, very well respected case officer on the operations side took me under his wing and actually brought me to some source meetings, which for analysts, there's a lot of separation between the two houses, and for me to get that opportunity was pretty tremendous and fascinating for me to see it as an analyst. And during the course of that relationship, he pulled me aside one day and really encouraged me to make the transition to the operations side of the house. So just to close that loop about how I made that leap. But yeah, a targeting officer, if I have any case officer friends listening right now, they might dispute this, but I would argue that targeting officers are what helps pull the strings on where the case officers go, who they're recruiting, the conversations they're having, the intelligence that we want. Targeting is really about trying to put us in the right place at the right time to get the info we need to complete the intelligence puzzle, if you will. Because you have to understand, we're getting, hundreds of pieces of data a day that we have to make sense of. We have to decide what's legitimate. We have to decide what to discard. And even then, there are estimates. I don't know how accurate these are, but I think it puts into perspective with everything going on in the world today, and with the voluminous resources the CIA and the intelligence community has, it's still estimated that we're still as a country only getting optics into about 15% of everything that's going on, of all the conversations, of all of the, exchanges of information. So when you consider that too, there's a lot that we're trying to forecast and telegraph without having all of the data.
If you and your team is the targeting people, like you said, you're kind of helping pull the strings for where the case officers are going to go. You're kind of lubing that track, greasing that track. If you make a determination, I just want to use an example. Zarqawi was killed in 2006, so a year before you would have been in the CIA. Is it similar to like, okay, we think the target officers, maybe the case officers, we've made the determination, we think Zarqawi is in X location. Do you hand that information over to the military and then they make a determination on whether they're going to act on it, or who makes the call once you've compiled the information, whether or not they're going to go get this person?
That's a great question. Let me take a step back on one other shift that occurred as a result of 9/11. So I'm sure you're a historian from, what I gather and listening to your show, and this world. So the 9/11 Commission report, and one of the takeaways from that is the reason that 9/11 happened was because there was not enough communication, and there was outright intentional prevention from agencies of other agencies being exposed to their intel, because there are turf wars, there are egos involved. And what came out of that as a solution was to build more of an ops center type of model. And the ops team model basically means, and that's why we have things now like the counterterrorism center, because it's meant to be a center that houses the different expertise from certain agencies. So under an ops team model, you're going to have not only targeting officers and representatives from the CIA on the ops and analysis side, including your case officers and your analysts, but they're also going to be working and often embedded, co-located with the likes of the NSA, the guys who listen to all the chatter, the signal intelligence that we call it. You're going to have the guys who look at imagery. You're going to have the law enforcement guy. You'll have your military liaison. So under that model, we're often all looking at similar things at the same time or the same data. We're just looking at it from a different perspective. The military is going to look at that. They're going to look at intelligence with the need and the perspective of planning and action. Whereas the CIA, for the most part, is meant to look at it with the need for understanding. And then you start, based on your different expertise, then you start delegating, okay, if a NSA, we need to drill down on this, this series of phone numbers, for instance. We need to start getting more clarity into who this network of cell towers or cell numbers are talking to. To our imagery guys from the likes of the NGA, we need to get better satellite imagery on this location and see who's coming and going. So the ops team model really was one of the big boons coming out of the 9/11, review and analysis of how that day came to fruition. So that's an overview of how our process would work, especially overseas. So, as a young targeting officer, I'm in a place, I'm in a CIA base in a place like Baghdad. Right next to me is going to be a military liaison that, we'll look to before communicating not only our posture to the military, but also relaying the military's intentions and plans and resources. So that's, in an ideal setting, that's how we all come together. And we took that very seriously, the role of the ops team model.
So I'm fascinated by what you just said, that you're going to relay your posture to the military liaison. They're going to kind of relay what they're thinking back to you guys. I imagine even if it works 95% of the time, there's going to be some disagreement at some point along this line. You can't work with people forever and not disagree. So if the ops center, the intelligence side has come to one conclusion and the military has come to a conclusion maybe you disagree with, or they want you to do something you don't want to do, or vice versa, how's something like that ironed out?
Yeah, David, 60% of the time it works every time, right? So, and we all have different, mission objectives, if you will. Again, our job as intelligence officers at the end of the day is to get intelligence for understanding and strategizing. The military, while that's an appreciation of theirs and still a need, the military, especially when you're in a declared war, I think that's a really important consideration for this era in which we're talking, about which we're talking. We are at war. We've declared war. We're over in places like Iraq and Afghanistan trying to go after those, not only go after those who executed 9/11. Again, bin Laden's still alive at this time. Saddam is gone, but the elements and the embers of his regime still have a close hold in Iraq. So we're still trying to fight that war as well. So it's a declared war, and in that sense, the military is trying is using that intelligence for action and for planning. So those two objectives can often butt heads because we have to consider the domino effect that a military movement could have on our intelligence objectives. So let's say that a known military operation is going to take out perhaps one of our key inroads to our intelligence puzzle that, for instance, is this guy an associate of bin Laden? Just talking in generalities. So we have to communicate that. And that's when, in an ideal situation, both parties come together and we kind of devil's advocate it, you know. Obviously, the final say, if it gets to that point, comes from the likes of the White House. So we don't always have the final say, but you're right. There oftentimes can be, and it's not always an issue of, you know, individual ego. Sometimes it is, because we tend to fall into this tribalism no matter who we work for, right? But it's often just competing objectives, and sometimes we have to prioritize those. And we had situations with intelligence officers where, you know, the military, for them, it was a successful operation, but it meant that we lost some insight into our intelligence picture at the time.
Yeah, I want the audience to understand how unbelievably complex this situation, like situations like this are. I think when people watch maybe a TV show, they watch a movie, they think it's like, oh, it's kind of cut and dry. As you know very well, that is not the case at all. I know you're undercover. When we think of undercover, what does that mean? Are we wearing disguises, or what are you doing? You just, people don't know you're in the CIA when you're overseas. What does that mean in a CIA sense?
Yeah, during this time, it's primarily the latter. People don't know I'm with the CIA. Now, for anybody who watches, you know, a lot of spy movies, you've probably heard terms like, you know, referring to different types of cover. So, for instance, in the first Mission Impossible movie, they talk about the knock list, which is non-official cover. Those are going to be your people that, you know, are more walking among you, that but might look like they're working for the private sector, and they may very well be. They have no government affiliation. My cover was more, and I you know, I can't speak in too many specifics, but I was on the ground in certain places for a government purpose, but it was not the CIA as far as anyone I interacted with was concerned in most cases. Now, some people, you know, start to get hip to some of the verbiage we might use versus another organization and so forth, and read between the lines. But yeah, that, you know, being undercover, I know you have a lot of military guys on the show, but it is an added consideration and, you know, obstacle for a lot of us sometimes, because you're undercover professionally, but also personally. So, you know, and I'm a young single guy at the time. So when I was lucky enough to get a girl to go out with me amidst my schedule, I was automatically most times starting off with a lie, you know, because I had to live my cover, right? So there are instances. I mean, the disguises are certainly a part of the job in some instances. During that time, you know, it was more about where we were and who we represented on paper, essentially. But yeah, I mean, and we all would, you know, that first tour deployment to a place like Iraq or Afghanistan, you know, we'd all grow our beards out. But you know, you're looking at me right now. I'm a fair-skinned, blue-eyed guy. No matter how long and dark my beard gets, I'm not posturing as a, you know, an Arab. So we didn't rely on the disguises too much in that era at that time.
I want to drill down on the dating thing real quick. I hadn't even considered that. So at any point when you were dating anyone, was the revelation ever made like, hey, I actually worked for the CIA? Because that is something like out of a movie that would happen.
Yeah, I lived my cover pretty well, and you know, maybe God was watching over me. My one real serious relationship happened to be somebody with the organization, which, by the way, you know, there was a rumor when I started, and I never verified this myself, but you know, and we're on the cusp of the rise of dating apps and so forth at this time that we're talking about. But there was always a rumor that there was a dating database within CIA, basically like a personals, you know, database to kind of see who else was single. I never explored that myself, but I can tell you there were a lot of relationships in the building. Some ended up being very long lasting. Others, you know, didn't, but they served a purpose at the moment. So yeah, that's a tough part, man. I mean, you know, I had a mentor from day one, who that was one of the things we talked about, how to manage that in my personal life. You know, I'm very close to my family, and when you're applying, you don't know if you're going to be given an undercover assignment. So, you know, my mom, who's, you know, the person I'm closest with in this world, raised me a single mother. of course she knew I was applying there, and there were some training days where she was able to come, like graduate, the culmination of training and see the lobby and so forth. And there are a couple of people that kind of, always joke about it. Oh, you might be in the CIA, never hear from you anymore, that type of stuff. So, but it definitely is a balance, and there's a reason why, especially when you're on the ops side, you tend to congregate together in social settings because, who am I going to talk about my day with other than the people that have lived it? I remember one time I was at a barbecue after I was on an R&R period, rest and relaxation. When you go to the war zones in the CIA, it's much different from the military. We have mandatory R&R periods where they send you out of theater. Part of it's the emotional toll that's being taken on you. Part of it, they don't want you to get burned if you're there too long from your cover. And it doesn't matter what you're working on. I mean, when that period of time, when you've hit your R&R, they send you out, man. It's pretty much enforced across the board. But anyway, I remember one time I was at this barbecue on an R&R, and the guys around me, around the same age, they were just starting to have kids, getting married, and they were talking about pressure washing their driveway and stuff like that. And then it gets to me in the circle, and I'm like, how about those dolphins, guys? Trying to change the subject. So I had nothing to offer that I really could based on what I had been doing the last year or so.
I want to pivot back a little bit to overseas, like you were just talking about burnout, things like that. But I'm curious, when you look back of your time overseas, was there one specific group, one enemy that was like especially crafty and really difficult to get a hold of? And I'll throw out an example again. I watched a documentary about Zarqawi a week ago, and they had McChrystal and Flynn in there talking about how Zarqawi was really good at evading capture. Like, he knew what the U.S. was doing. He knew how to not get caught, didn't use cell phones. Very crafty. Got him anyways, but very crafty. For you, is there any group of terrorists or whatever it might be that were just unbelievably difficult to track down?
Yeah, I think that would be, and again, he was taken out soon before I started. So that's one example I learned from. There were case studies of the operations that took him out in my training and so forth. I think, and also, we over here, when you read about this stuff in open source, we talk about it as Al Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban, but they're all common enemies to us when you're over there, and they all, they kind of learn and share from each other. But yeah, ISIS. When I was in Iraq, we were starting to see the rise of AQI, which would become ISIS. So al-Baghdadi was starting to, really get some traction as a leader. He was very good. And part of that is the network that they have on the ground. That, again, that goes back to us playing from behind as an agency, because we're coming to this war on terror that marked a huge paradigm shift for our operations. They have an established base there, and we're on their home field, and it took a lot of learning. It took some mistakes for us to really learn how to navigate. Part of my time in Iraq, we were using an underground group of Iraqi intel officers that were not loyal to the Saddam regime, we were using them to do some operations in the streets. We learned a lot from them. But everything you just mentioned about the likes of Zarqawi and their tradecraft is exacerbated by their culture. And what I mean by that is, as Americans, as Westerners, we are very much an on-demand culture, right? We expect results right away. They are like that. They're willing to go underground for years at a time because they see this as this existential war. And I think that's also a consideration for where we are today, which I'm sure we'll talk about, in a little bit too, because we don't want to take our eye off that ball. They're willing to go underground. They're willing to, reconstitute themselves after losses in a way that our culture cannot sympathize or fathom. That they'll go quiet for a decade, and that makes it really hard when you're an intelligence officer and you're, you're trying to, you need them talking all the time, right? You need them moving all the time. Well, if they are of a mindset and of a wiring that, hey, I'll just wait this out until the next shiny object comes along for the Americans, and then I'll start to, reemerge from my hole, essentially. That's the toughest part of dealing with that culture and the counterterrorism efforts at the time in particular, and it still is to this day.
It is fascinating you bring that up. Fascinating to me, because I know a guy from the unit who has said he thinks the fight, and I don't want to name him, he thinks the fight on terror is one that is decades from still being over. He thinks it's a 40, 50-year war, and the public doesn't understand that. Do you agree that the public has no idea what's out there?
Absolutely. And 9/11 was an example. They planned that for years, and our culture now, our younger, our upcoming generation, it's to no fault of their own, but everything is on demand. It's instant gratification and glorification. Well, if you are dealing with an enemy that, again, is willing to fight a multi-generational war, it's going to be very hard to combat that. And there are issues in the line of intelligence right now from a personnel standpoint. I left just under 10 years for various reasons. I have former colleagues who did the same, whereas, the Cold War type of personnel, there were a lot of those guys stayed with the agency for 25, 30 years. So that expertise was able to, to maintain, but also be conveyed to the next generation. And I think that's a big gap right now for our intelligence community is not only recruiting, but retaining and keeping around really good people for the duration to fight this decades-long war.
Do you think politicians, the people that vote on the laws, they vote on whether or not, well, in theory, they're supposed to vote on whether or not we're going somewhere overseas. Do you think the political establishment has the stomach to chase this wherever it could go for 40, 50 years?
You mean the guys who are only worried about campaigning so they stay in office?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm...
Yeah, no, and that, not from what I've seen, and that's unfortunate. It's we chase the shiny object, and that paradigm shift that I talked about, where we went from that Cold War era style of intelligence gathering, which really up until 9/11, in terms of a foundational practice, was all that the intelligence community knew. Everything that we did in terms of tradecraft was based on that Cold War mentality. So then you have counterterrorism come in and, marks that shift. Well, now the pendulum's starting to swing back because of Russia and China and what's happening with Ukraine. So, and I haven't been in the building for a few years, so I can't speak directly to the day-to-day. Obviously, that's impacted by different administrations and leadership at the agency. But I'm sure the same pitfalls that we ran into after 9/11, we're seeing now come back to bite us as, Russia becomes the top priority. But lying in the weeds, lying in waiting, are these terrorist enemies? Because again, they're not only, by the way, going underground, but they're watching and analyzing everything that we do. And you spoke to something about, the tradecraft the likes of Zarqawi would implement. A lot of that came from what he learned from our open source. So, the media has a big role in exposing our work sometimes as well. And I think we take for granted that, it's just domestically consumed by an American audience, but that's not the case. I questioned, interrogated a lot of guys I was in a lot of interrogations, at least, where these questions would come up, and they told us, yeah, we're reading your papers, we're watching your TV programs, we're, monitoring your news, and they're learning a lot just from that. So that's a scary revelation as well.
That's wild. Yeah, that's a great point. I don't think the public ever would have guessed that they're following what we see here in the news or Wikipedia or whatever you could read online to get kind of whatever edge they might need. I do want to talk now about when you're on the ground, and I know we talked briefly off camera that you had some cross paths with some tier 1 operators during your time in the CIA. As an outside person, who watches what they do and works with them, but is not part of Delta Force SEAL Team 6. What is your impression of Tier 1 operators as someone who sees them but is not part of them?
I think they're probably, in terms of skill set, the most well-rounded people in the U.S. government and probably in our entire country. You know, they I think in the movies a lot, when you know, going back, I might be dating myself here for some of your audience, maybe not, but you go back to the Rambo movies and Commando and stuff like that, you know, they're often portrayed as brawny knuckle draggers. And that's honestly, that's kind of how operators writ large, I think, are viewed by the likes of DC politicians often, but they're incredibly smart. I mean, you know, I remember having a conversation with the SEAL team counterpart, and his knowledge of chemistry was, you know, rivaled any PhD coming out of an Ivy League school. And that was from, you know, his work and training. So that always struck me, you know, based on the relationships that I had. And they tend to, when you're actually interacting with them, they use their brains over their brawn first. You know, and I don't think they get the recognition for that as much as they should, for how smart those guys are. So yeah, we had a really good working relationship. You know, there was a period when I was at CIA base in Baghdad, at the height of some pretty tense conflict. After things had kind of been a little calm for a while, it spiked back up one summer, and you know, I was meeting with the Delta teams almost on a daily basis, and having those interactions. And you know, I remember being in meetings with General Odierno at the time, who was commander for the ground in Iraq, you know, following Petraeus. So we had a good relationship. But yeah, those guys are, you know, I would put their brains above their brawn over pretty much anybody in our, definitely in our intelligence community, and our government as a whole. I mean, they're some of the smartest guys I've ever known.
That's a fascinating answer. I throw this question to everyone I interview who has any knowledge of the subject. It's a fun one. You can answer as much as you want or not, but okay. The viewers know what's coming. The best debate we have on this show is SEAL Team 6 versus Delta Force. Is a CIA targeting officer. How would you compare and contrast those two, the two best direct action units in the U.S. military?
All right, let me caveat this, if I may. Professionally, most of my day-to-day, when I was embedded with the likes of a military unit, it was primarily with Delta Army Rangers. So because of that, I probably am more biased because I have those, you know, direct relationships. Now, that being said, one of my first chiefs at the agency was a former SEAL team operator, and he was a you know, no nonsense leader, but also had a very compassionate side. So I'm going to bias toward the Delta guys just because I had most of my day-to-day relationships, and there were some times when, you know, my life probably depended on their prowess and ability, as maybe theirs did on mine. I don't know at the time, but yeah, I'll bias toward the Delta. But if you're a SEAL team guy, you know, listening, that's not a knock on you. It's just I had more exposure, when, you know, in terms of the operations I conducted was mainly with the Delta guys through JSOC.
Very, very fair answer. That's a good answer.
Diplomatic answer. Am I ready for Congress? Okay.
Very diplomatic answer. All right. One of the things you always see, like you've been talking about the Mission Impossible movies, you've been talking about the Bourne movies with Matt Damon. All of those are very fun. The common theme in those movies, though, is there's a phone that goes off. Now we have 1 minute, or we got 10 minutes to save the world, or everything's going to blow up. Does stuff like that actually happen in the CIA, where a phone, the red phone goes off, and now we have to save the world and no one's going to know? Or is that just a Hollywood drama?
Look, man, if we only had 10 minutes to save the world, that means we've been pissed poor at our job. You know, especially in this day and age with all of the technical tools we have in intelligence gathering. But I will say there have been times, it's not necessarily a save the world mentality, but there have been times when a target has quickly emerged and we have to, you know, circle the wagons like that. I've been a part of a few conversations, some by phone. I'll tell you one story. It was about 3 a.m. at Langley, and I had to follow a senior leader, or I had to track down a senior leader, and found him in the men's room, and I had to brief him, and we had about not a little more than 10-minute window, but it was maybe a half-hour window at most to decide if we could conduct an operation. So that was fun. I was outside his stall briefing him while he was, conducting some business.
And did they pull the trigger on the operation?
Yeah, I think he was just eager to finish his business, so he gave a pretty quick approval, and it ended up being a good, it ended up being a successful objective.
In a situation like that where it's very fluid and like you said, your time window at most is 10 to 30 minutes, you got someone at the phone at Langley, maybe you got someone on the ground. Is there someone at the White House that is also in these ongoing conversations, briefing the president in real time?
So there's at the time, and I'll caveat it then because, every administration can have a different process, and sometimes, new authorities and regulations are passed. But at the time, there was a baseline authority given to our leadership chain. And if it exceeded, there were some extenuating circumstances for certain high value targets, HVTs as we call them. So for instance, there were certain things that we would not do, or certain areas, certain conditions under which we would not conduct an operation for 99% of our targets. However, there were extenuating circumstances where those might be, their exceptions would be made for the likes of Osama bin Laden, for instance. So the short answer is it kind of depended, but not really, because 99% of the time we knew what the baseline was, and we didn't have to call the White House every single time because of that.
So with a situation though, with like maybe Anwar al-Awlaki, and I apologize if I'm butchering that pronunciation, but I think that's close to how you say his name.
It's close enough. Hey man, I'm American. I'm in the South. I butchered a lot of those guys when I was there. So,
in a situation like that though, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Obama personally sign off on hitting him with a drone?
Yeah, and that was again an extenuating circumstance because of where he was located, right? So he's not in our defined war zone, but he's a part of, he's seen as an enemy combatant as part of this war. So you have to get, to call the president and say, look, we got this guy in Yemen. Yemen's not Iraq or Afghanistan. We're not at war in Yemen. So that would be an example of, if Alaki had been in Iraq or Afghanistan, I imagine those baseline approvals would have applied, but that was an extenuating circumstance where you had to get that final say from the president.
And then the last example I'll throw out, because you just said Afghanistan, Iraq, when they took out Soleimani in Iraq, that's in a country that we're in, but he's an Iranian, leader. Some would say it's the second most powerful person in Iran. I don't know if that's accurate or not. There's no way they're hitting someone like that without the president of the United States signing off on it, right?
Correct. Yes. I wasn't a part of that operation, so I can't speak to the ins and outs of it. But yeah, there's and a good president and a good leader will do right by our operators and our military, our intelligence community, and they will say. And I've been in rooms where, I served under 5 directors of the CIA, for instance. I've been in rooms where the CIA director at the time said, I'll worry about the blowback. You guys do your job, and you accomplish your mission. Sometimes it goes the other way. Now, we also tend to get used for political expediency. So they might give an approval and think it's going to go seamless, and then it does it. And then it's like the reverse of a pro sports or a college sports coach, right? They get none of the glory and all of the grief, right? Well, we typically get the grief. We never get the glory. Like a big thing you have to accept in that line of work is your failures are frontline news, and your successes often aren't reported on until well after the fact. And it goes the same way a lot of times with the relationship with politicians. If it's seamless, if the American people are rah-rah about it and behind it, they'll take all the credit. But if it's flawed and it leads to some, some misguided results or unfortunate results, it's, whoa, hey, I don't know what those guys are doing now. And that's something you have to put up with at the job. That was probably the hardest part about the job for me at times, was being in some social settings when, some certain hot button issues related to that line of work were being debated by friends or pundits I was around, and I can't really say anything, but I really want to. That was really difficult when you're working in the job at the time. Now that I'm out, I'm a, full-fledged civilian, I'm happy to share thoughts as much as I can.
Are you able to, do you mind if we briefly touch on Benghazi, just because I think some of the things you said
Sure.
kind of connect to it. And that wasn't, I hadn't initially planned on that, but I think it's interesting given what you're saying. In a situation, for our viewers who don't know, Benghazi, was that 2012, right? 2011, 2012?
Yeah, we just celebrated the 11th last year. So yeah, 11, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so we had the consulate where Ambassador Stevens was, and there was the CIA annex. He gets killed. 3 other people get killed, 2 at the CIA annex. It's a shit show, unlike you can put into words. The CIA and a lot of people were thrown under the bus for that. But I mean, it became a very hot topic issue.
Right.
Why didn't they send help sooner? Why,
Right.
Were we not better prepared? Whatever it might be. You as a member of the CIA, when you see what the response was, Obama famously went to a fundraiser while Benghazi was ongoing. What are your thoughts on a situation like that is violent, fluid, and then turns into an absolute circus after the fact?
So let me first start by saying Benghazi was one of the most avoidable deaths of our personnel in U.S. history. And it was the first flashpoint for me that started to think, all right, I need to really assess this line of work, because if those guys can be left out to dry, that I knew not closely, but Ty and Glenn, who are the 2 CIA operators that were killed that day, I knew their counterparts at our bases in places like Afghanistan and Iraq very well. It could have just as easily been them or any of us. So that was the day for me that really underscored that when we talk about the CIA in terms of the American public, it's really important you to understand there are 2 CIAs. There are the men and women, the boots on the ground, who sacrifice in ways that nobody can ever appreciate or understand, and they will do so in spite of what happens with the leadership in Washington and at the CIA. So the CIA that most people read about are those political appointees. They're the public faces. They're the directors of the CIA, the White House, the National Security Council. And unfortunately, there are times in our history when they have not done right by the boots on the ground and the people that are if you were thinking about the CIA as a corporation, the day-to-day workers, not the executives, the people that are the whole reason why the CIA is able to be successful. That was a very sad and tragic day for a lot of us. And I think for some of us that up until that point might have been a little naive about, trusting our leadership implicitly. That was a real gut check for us.
Do you think that there were options that could have been used that weren't used? And you
Yes.
better than I do, but the only help that immediately came was from Tripoli, right? The guys that came in from Tripoli, I think there was 2 Delta Force guys, there was a couple CIA guys, and
they came late as well. Yeah, they came on a delay. And people can read about this and make their own judgments, but I can tell you, when the chief of station is a role throughout the world, and again, you can read about this. I'm not revealing any trade secrets, and I'll talk in generalities right now. But the chief of station is the CIA's final say-so in country. Historically, that's been the case. That didn't change when we gravitated from the Cold War era to counterterrorism. Benghazi, in the lead up to Benghazi, DOS of Libya had requested certain support that was denied. And part of the reason I believe, and there's enough evidence out there in the public domain to support this, but also based on what I knew, internally. And I will caveat, Libya, that part of Africa and the world was never an AOR of mine, an area of responsibility. So I'm speaking, partly on the periphery, but also knowing how things work. I've never known a COS to get denied because of, the regard in which that position is held. And I believe the evidence shows that his requests, if they were fulfilled, meant that the political narrative that was out there at the time was not going to be in line with what was happening on the ground. And I think that we had 4 Americans, again, 2 of them, Glenn and Ty, who I, knew to a more casual degree through the work, did not have to die as a result. And that's an unfortunate, again, revelation when at the end of the day, when you're in this line of work, you're putting your lives in the hands of those people in Washington that, they're playing the political game as much as anything with your lives. And that was a scary revelation that day.
Number one, I agree with your assessment of why resources were denied, because for the audience, the government wanted everyone to believe Libya had been this huge success.
Right. And it was not.
Yeah. Thank you. Take it away. No, feel free. Can you explain more on that?
No, it was, it was a miscalculation, and it was, sometimes my mom used to tell me when I was a kid, I give you an inch, you take a mile. Libya was an example of our national security posture and policy at the time, where we had gotten a few inches with, what we were doing under the guise of the war on terror, and we took a mile. We started going after, guys like Gaddafi in a way where, they were bad dudes, but also, there wasn't as much consideration for the aftermath of what we would do if we, built a presence on the ground in a place like Libya. And so at the time, and again, this wasn't my direct area ever, but this from open source, they wanted to posture that this is a success. I've told a few people with regard to what's going on in our own country right now that if you want to learn about martyrdom, go study the case of Gaddafi's, murder and what happened after, and how the Americans and Western allies were viewed, who, had even an inkling of a role with that. Sometimes the enemy is better than the enemy you don't know. And I think Libya has, as a result, become a breeding ground for terrorism throughout that part of the world that, going back to our earlier points, we will not realize for several years to come what the outcome of that, really botched approach to Libya at the time was.
If I made you the president of the United States, and this is a narrow question in the sense that once the situation in Benghazi began to unfold and you are now in charge, you're getting to make all the calls. Just be honest with the audience. Could they have sent fighter jets? Could they have? So
do whatever the hell they want, man. And you have bases strategically in that area where the transit time, if you had acted at the right time, you could have gotten more resources to the scene, gotten them on the X and likely prevented those murders. You could have. They had plenty of time to reinforce the facilities, that's for sure, because COS, was making requests for a period of time prior to all this happening. It was getting denied. I think in 1 or 2 cases was getting ignored, not just denied. It's one thing to get denied, but when nobody even responds, right? That's even worse. And I think that's a big challenge, and an unfortunate reality of this world is that my approach to our line of work, the people on the ground know best, because they're looking out their window right now and seeing what's happening in real time. And they should be the ones driving whatever comes in that region and in their location, not the people in Washington who are waxing poetic, who might be philosophizing, about certain outcomes. It's the people on the ground. If we don't prioritize protecting every American life who is sacrificing for the rest of America, then, we are just doing an incredible injustice to these men and women. And that's what Benghazi was, I believe. And just an injustice to those 4 individuals and their families.
And I encourage everyone watching this to read as much as you can about Benghazi. There's a solid, it's almost like an action movie, 13 hours.
Yeah.
John Krasinski. It's all worth getting into. But point off the Benghazi thing, right after Benghazi, the Obama presidency decided that Syria would be our next great experiment. And from someone who was in the CIA, even if that wasn't your area of responsibility, did you?
And it dovetailed, though, because there was a lot of, especially in Iraq, right? There was a lot of relationship there.
Do you think getting involved in Syria was a mistake?
Yeah, I do, to the degree in which we have. Again, that's another tinderbox that, when are we as a country, as Western society, going to see that come to fruition of all of our failed efforts there? It could be tomorrow, it could be a couple years from now. And we cannot, us as a country and as a culture, and we talked about this, a little bit earlier in terms of how they view planning and preparation versus us. We have to accept that is a part of the world that is so divergent from our way of life, that to think that we can go in these places and come out the hero or the victor is very myopic. And it's very dangerous to the men and women we do put in those situations, and to the innocent people who are living and from those countries. Again, we had a few inches with the war on terror. We were having some success. We took that and we tried to get a mile out of it. And, we will see ramifications from what's been happening in places like, parts of Libya and Africa and Syria for years to come. And you and I might be talking about this in 10 years. It might all of a sudden become the main priority for national security because of that.
Well, here's the thing about Syria that's confusing to me. Maybe you feel similar, or maybe you can help explain it. I think everyone agrees Assad, not a good dude, bad guy, killed his own people, not a saint. No one as far as I know is ever claiming he's that.
Right.
Having said that, he is seen for a long time to have the insane people in his country under control. Like Syria wasn't a hotbed of extremism because him and his dad ruled with an iron fist, and better to dance with, like you said earlier, with the devil than the one you don't. What were they thinking by thinking if we get rid of this strong man who, again, terrible dude, not condoning some of the things he's done, certainly not. The alternative we saw was insane Islamic terror. Why would they even try to think that outcome was better?
Look, man, I think it's American hubris. And, I love our country. I was proud to serve for a period of my life, but we have this hubris that we think we can go in and people will just wake up and gravitate toward a democracy. That people will just love us for liberating them. And that's not the case. We're talking about a tribalism and generation of barbarism that we can't come close to sympathizing with. So we make these miscalculations because we think, okay, we got Saddam out of there. Who's the next guy on the list? Well, you might know the next guy on the list, but do we know who's going to replace that guy? And do we have the resources in place to combat that? And it's a fair criticism of American foreign policy, especially in this part of the world. We'll go in and we'll do action A, but we have no plan in place for action B. And people on the ground there, meaning the citizens of these countries, they remember that. And we create a new breed and generation of enemies by doing so, I firmly believe.
Didn't we help overthrow the Egyptian dictator and then they elected the Muslim Brotherhood, and then we had to get the military in Egypt to overthrow them. Like, does this cycle just not end? Isn't that what happened?
Well, in the Middle East, it doesn't. Again, I mean, it's so anathema to our way of life, and the corruption, and like you said, you take a guy like Assad, but you compare him to a guy like Gaddafi, and it's like, okay, I don't know who's worse, and why necessarily should we? We can't be the world's hero every time there is a bad actor in place. We can keep them at bay and protect our interests, and in doing so, I think be an example and embolden people. I think there is a way in these countries, whether it's Egypt, Syria, Libya, Iraq, to embolden people on their own and inspire them to take movement and to take action. And it might mean, a civil wars by their standard or what have you. But that, for whatever reason, that's not enough for the policymakers. And I've never, I've never been supportive of that mentality and approach. But let's just go after the next guy. He's just a bad dude. Let's get it. That it puts our own people in harm's way. Again, it creates this vacuum of, enemies at the end of the day. And it fails to account for the legions of people who grow up as kids seeing the Americans come in and out. And look at our Afghanistan withdrawal almost 2 years ago now. The ramifications of that are going to be immense to our national security over the next decade or so.
I want to touch on now a couple things in terms of, again, dealing with foreign countries. The first one is, when you think of foreign intel agencies, which one of our enemy agencies should the U.S. public be most concerned about?
Well, I think China has us by the balls right now.
Let's dive into that.
Yeah. So, and again, I'm not an expert on China. I just want to caveat that. I'll be upfront. I was a counterterrorism guy, and that was my bread and butter. But I know that the way that China has penetrated our culture and our society is a phenomenal case study in intelligence. And, one of the hardest things to do when you're dealing with bad actors, whether it's an official government or whether it's a terrorist group, is having to give them credit where credit's due and having to recognize their strengths. But by doing so, that's the only way you can build an effective counter campaign. I believe China has been waging what will become World War III for the last decade or so, at least. The way that they have penetrated our society from the financial side, from the cyber side, from the business side, they own land. If you look at the map, how much land do they own of this country right now? From placing their own human resources into our country. And, that threatens to become an endangered species for the Americans, because we put such a high priority on our technical prowess and our technical intelligence skills that if we don't weight as equally the human side of the house, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And I think China has really created this ratio of penetration from all facets that is a very scary realization for our country. Their alliances overseas, whether they are overtly known or more subtle, you see what they've been, the meetings they've had with the Saudis, the way they've hedged their relationships with the Russians over the last couple of years. All of that is with the objective of, taking America down. And they're, from what I know and from what we read and what's reported, they've done it very well. And that is a very effective strategic intelligence approach. And it's one that, again, I believe that they recognize too our vulnerabilities in, exhausting our resources for the war on terror in the last 20 years. And now we're seemingly exhausting our resources for Russia, Ukraine, and you read about their military posture versus ours. You just go down the list and you have to give China credit where credit's due. And that's not to say tweet me that I'm a Chinese sympathizer or anything, but let's be honest, they're our most formidable adversary right now. And I hope that my friends who are still on the job back in places like Langley, are well prepared and are countering in ways that we don't know about. But China is my biggest concern from the geopolitical stage right now.
I think it says a lot, and I'd love it if you could weigh in on this. I think it says a lot that American celebrities, like, let's just throw a name out, LeBron James.
Yeah.
LeBron James, who is an icon to young Americans, can't bring himself to criticize human rights violations in China, but he will criticize the First Amendment here in the United States. Pretty remarkable, don't you think?
Yeah, and it's always the people who I think are, very financially sound and have, pretty nice lives that are quick to criticize us here in this country. But, I've traveled to some pretty intense places where a lot of the stuff people complain about in our country is actually a reality there. And that has led me to be able to determine, when I talk to people here in America, who spent time outside of this country and who has not, and if you spend time outside this country, you tend to know that those criticisms are pretty vapid. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that, and also don't speak about it. If you're just spouting talking points and you're not versed in it, you've never had exposure, why does anyone have to speak about it? We know because of the financial stake China has in a lot of our, industry right now. And it spans from sports and entertainment to, other corporate entities. So, and that also goes back to the propaganda machine that China, has really built up for when they bring people to China, right? They're able to show, what visitors who don't have a lot of, insight otherwise, they're able to show them this world that seems pretty idyllic. And that type of propaganda works. Look, there is a day and age, and I think we still are pretty versed in it, when Americans could do the same in other countries and really utilize a propaganda machine effectively. But China does that better than anybody right now.
If you were running the show, like, what could we be doing to combat China's influence? Let me throw a suggestion out. You tell me if it's a good one or a bad one. Don't let them buy land in this country.
Yep. Yeah, I live in Florida, man, and our governor has been criticized. That was a recent policy. I believe it's now in law here in Florida. But yeah, I mean, just that should be so simple, and it's not that a Chinese person who moves here as an individual and wants to live the American life can't buy land, but why would we want Chinese entities owning our land, especially our farmland, by the way? They've targeted our farmland, which is the source of our food and our energy and our way of life. And that's a no-brainer for me. So that's certainly an element. I think, and I hope, again, that we have the right human apparatus. When I say human, that means human intelligence apparatus in that part of the world. And we're not just relying on our signal intelligence and our technical prowess, because, again, China's master manipulators of, the cyber world. I do think people, need to be more cognizant of their data sharing. I know it sounds far-fetched to maybe just an everyday citizen, but they're looking at all of that, just as I mentioned earlier, when we would talk to our Al-Qaeda detainees, they're watching us. They're watching our data. They're paying attention to that. We take it for granted, but I would like, and you and I talked to before we started recording. I bias more toward libertarian and not a big, massive regulation guy. But there are certain things that if we don't start getting a stronghold on right now, my kids, the next generation of kids are going to see a lot of Chinese influence in our world and society, I believe.
Do you think if China were to jump on Taiwan in the next 6 to 12 months, there's anything we could could we stop them, in your opinion?
I think we missed that window from what I know. And again, I'm not a subject matter expert on that part of the world, but I do fear that we are rapidly approaching a period where we are going to find our military resources stretched even thinner than before. And that's saying a lot, between Ukraine and the Taiwan situation. I think, I don't think we're going to have a choice, if and when that escalates over there. And I fear that we're not going to be adequately prepared to combat it in a meaningful way. And you look at our military recruiting numbers, man. I mean, they're down.
They're terrible.
I've got a guy, a very close friend of mine, who's like a brother, is retiring from the Navy this year after 25 years. He said he's never seen morale so low in the military. And guess what, man? China knows all that. Russia knows all that. That's not lost on them. So they will know the optimal time to escalate, and it will be at a time, I believe, when we are at our weakest and most strained.
That is a very ominous thing. I just got 2 questions left for you.
Sure, man.
And this has been great. The first one's a serious one, and then the last one, we're going to end on a fun one, is, and I know that you had mentioned some drone stuff earlier. How much did drones, the ability to we just fly a robot in the sky with a Hellfire missile attached to it, how did that change the dynamics over there?
Oh man, that it changed it quite a bit. I came into operations when drones were, starting to become more prevalent, without saying too much. I do think they were an expedient solution for the administration at the time. Drone strikes, at least, mean you don't have to detain combatants. You don't have to worry about the legalities of detaining and interrogating. I think there were some really bad dudes and high value targets that were taken off the map in a good way. But the downside is we lost some insight into our intelligence picture in some cases. I think it did make the enemy combatants in places like the Fatah, where they were, at the time I was there, were primarily used. Now I think they've expanded from, what I read. It made them much more OPSEC savvy and operational security savvy in terms of how they travel in transit. I think they were a double-edged sword. They still are to this day. They also provide a lot of, intelligence and optics on people on the ground and in places that we could never get without them. But I do think, again, inches and miles, right? We got a few inches, and they were a successful tool. I think they can still be and should be an important tool in our intelligence and operational toolbox, but we should never become reliant on that technology. They also ushered in, I think, a new era of modern warfare. So that will be interesting to see. I do believe, and this isn't hyperbole, or it's not meant to be, I do believe that we are going to be drawn into a more traditional war within the next year. Primarily, I think things are escalating incrementally into our involvement in Ukraine and Russia, unfortunately. But it'll be interesting to see what that more traditional warfare looks like because of the onset of drone technology. And, and I will say, it's a safer way for us to get involved sometimes. You don't have men in the cockpit. You've got a multi-million-dollar aircraft. If it gets shot down, it's a loss to the taxpayers, but no loss of human life. So again, there are some benefits to it. And I'm a proponent of them when used in the right way.
Would you personally, let's take the Bin Laden raid, for example. One of the options they had was they could have dropped the bomb on the building. They could have hit it with a drone or a plane, whatever, or they could go with the operators, and they chose to go with SEAL Team 6. You personally, would you favor using drone strikes in a situation like that, or putting guys on the ground to do it?
I think for someone like him, the way that it was done was as flawless as it could have been. And I think there was a messaging behind it too, that I am a proponent of. Having him come face to face with an American it might seem silly, but there is a message behind that. I, and again, I did not work that operation in full transparency. I know the people that did. I was adjacent to that operation when I was working, so it had a massive domino effect on the work I was doing at the time. But I think there would have been some added risk with the drone because of the location of where it is, and we didn't quite have the clarity inside the compound, and trying to minimize, women and kids being killed, even with somebody like Bin Laden. And we would have never learned that he had a massive porn collection if we hadn't have, locked our guys in there. So that's made for some good fodder over the years, right? And we say that tongue in cheek, but stuff like that actually is good. That is good insight, because you can use that in propaganda, right? You have this guy who has promoted himself to his followers as this pious, very spiritual Muslim man, and then he's obviously acting and consuming certain things in a way that is quite at odds with Muslim teachings by the Prophet. So there's some added intel that we got from the way in which we went in that I think was very beneficial.
All right, last one. If you could tell the audience one TV show or movie that you feel is the most realistic representation of life in the CIA, which one would it be and why?
All right, so let me caveat that I haven't watched a lot. I actually haven't gravitated. I love the Mission Impossible because it's so out there that you just get, you go nuts. But just like my father, who's a lawyer, yells at the TV screen when he's watching Law and Order, I have a lot of moments like that with certain programming. I will say, when I got out and got to a period where I was able to, let people know that I'd actually been working there, a friend of mine was a big fan of Homeland. And she asked me to watch it with her. Now, there were some things in that very first scene where, you have Claire Danes as a female driving through the streets of Baghdad on her cell phone, all alone, and there's mountains in the backdrop. I was yelling at that because I've been to Baghdad. I don't remember mountains in the backdrop, and no CIA officer, let alone an American female, would be driving through the streets just on her cell phone device. But I will say there were elements of the culture of the CIA that show from the episodes I saw captured very well. And I think the internal struggle that a lot of us can have in that line of work, being undercover, that, Claire Danes' character and a few others are going through, that they capture really well. And at the time, my understanding was they got some really good access to the agency. The agency has a great group of people whose one of their primary roles is to liaise with Hollywood and the media, on our portrayals in movies and television. So that's one from what I've seen, that in terms of the culture, they captured a decent amount. Obviously Hollywood and I'm a producer myself now, so I certainly appreciate taking some creative liberties, but I would say that one, if you really want to, grasp the culture. I'd love to write a comedy about the CIA though, because there's a lot of folly to the work too, that I think would be, if you made a show where it was The Office met Langley, I think that could also really show parts of the culture in a real authentic way. Maybe one day we'll get a chance to do that.
Well, Brandon, I gotta say thank you. This has been fascinating. It lived up to the hype of the first ever CIA member to come on the show. Can you tell the audience real quick where they can find you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, partly because of my background. I'm not a big social media guy, but, follow me on Twitter. I think it's Brand_Blackburn. And, I'm producing some TV, so hopefully you'll see a few things come out. And, yeah, man, thanks for the time and give me a chance and, talk about this organization and that background. I really appreciate it.